young mom, single mom. Her and her boyfriend broke up. She had a 3-year-old son. They're in this upstairs bedroom. She has an adult brother that lives with her and her parents. I think she's about 20, 21 years old, 3-year-old boy. She's taking a nap on her bed. She's got her son laying on the bed with her, eating ice cream, watching cartoons. Door's unlocked. The adult brother comes into the room, just unannounced, charges in there, starts stabbing her. She gets paralyzed almost immediately because he stabbed her in the back of the neck. She can't move. She has to sit there and watching him on the ground stabbing her 3-year-old son. The suspect runs out of the house. 45 minutes later, she wasn't able to call because she can't move. We finally get to the house. She's telling us that the last words are told the patrol officers. She told the patrol officers her son's last words are, "I love you, Mommy," as he's laying there.
Have you ever worked with a partner who just didn't seem to care about the reasons why he decided to be a police officer? Or what would cause him to have no empathy or sympathy for victims? How should command staff reprimand an officer that violates policy or procedure? How can you gain public trust if you have an officer that doesn't care about his profession? In this griping episode, join seasoned investigator Darren Robbins, boasting over 30 years of invaluable experience as he unravels a shocking internal affairs case. He was a former sergeant of the Fontana Police Department for the final 8 years of his law enforcement career. Darren now serves as a private investigator for the Titan Group. Tune in as he discusses a troubling IA case involving an accused officer who grossly neglected his duty during a domestic violence radio call for service. Don't miss out on his compelling narrative exposing the lack of accountability in the accused officer's IA interview. Stay tuned for an eye-opening exploration of justice and the challenges faced in law enforcement. Welcome to Internal Affairs, a police podcast. Let's go. Darren, thanks for coming, man. I really appreciate you coming down here and, sharing some stories about internal affairs.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. Yeah. Look, it's as you've seen the episodes, because I am an LAPD alum, it's a pleasure to get a different lens and a different perspective from an outside agency. We'll get into your rap sheet, or what I like to call the trip down memory lane, and talk a little bit about who you are and get on this good stuff. But this is how we start the episode. Okay, so here we go. On a scale to 1 to 10, right? 10 being the highest. Rate the importance of internal affairs and why.
I would say about a 6 or a 7. And the reason for that is internal affairs has an important role to play in law enforcement, but they're not on an island. For example, an administrator, agency head a lot of times drives the direction of internal affairs, how often they're used. Frontline supervisors take complaints that go to internal affairs a lot of times. They have to be involved in that process and actually give internal affairs a chance to get involved. And also what I found out when I worked internal affairs is as these cases work their way through discipline, arbitration, even litigation, frontline supervisors in every unit inside the department play a huge role in the outcome because they're the ones who write performance evaluations on these employees. And if the performance evaluations don't match the agency's perspective on this employee, that can be a real problem later on. If nothing's documented along the way, and then they try to terminate somebody for 20 different incidences over a period of time, and only one of them was documented, and that's the very last one. First thing the attorney representing the terminated employee brings up is, well, let's look at this employee's performance evaluations for the last 10 years. In every category, they were rated competent, above average, or superior, and now you're going to fire them because you're saying they've been a substandard employee for 20 years. Yeah. That's a problem.
Yeah, and to that point, that's more important.
Yeah.
Hey, they walk on water and they split the Red Seas.
Right.
Yep. We are just stellar, but in that rating period, which is normally a year, right? It's an annual.
Yeah, an annual.
This is when the incident happened.
Right. And personnel and training, hiring backgrounds. If you hire somebody that's a sociopath, no amount of training or policy instruction is going to make any difference with that person. So that's a very important part of any law enforcement agency is hiring.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thanks for that. So I want you to finish this sentence for me. As an internal affairs investigator, my job is to
leave no stone unturned Be extremely thorough. Investigate an internal affairs complaint like you would a murder investigation or a serious felony crime. You talk to every witness that's available, regardless of their background, regardless of what you think initially their credibility might be. You lock them into a statement, and you take your time and you be thorough. You don't want these cases to drag out forever. You want the complainant to get closure. You want the accused employee to get closure as well, but you want to be very thorough. You owe it to everybody involved. You owe it to the accused employee, you owe it to the complainant, and you owe it to the agency, as well as to society at large.
Let me ask you this, Darren, because I've been wondering as all these guests are coming to talk about this topic that seems to be a bit taboo, if you will. Is there any expectations that so for example, you get this case, and my understanding is you work for the Titan Group and you do a lot of these internal affairs investigations currently. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, Titan Group, we do a lot of internal affairs investigations for police departments. Yeah. We do investigations, Title IX investigations for colleges, K through 12, employee misconduct allegations for schools. We're experts on POBAR. We're mostly retired police officers. We have an attorney on staff as well. Our owner, Ed Saucerman, he's a retired police officer. And we also do firefighter Bill of Rights investigations, employee misconduct there. We do surveillance. We do computer investigations. We have a computer forensics expert on staff. So we do a lot of different types of investigations. Yeah,
no, D1, All-American.
Yep, backgrounds as well.
That's the way I see it. They are our proud sponsor of the show, and I couldn't thank Ed enough for jumping on board and connecting and linking with me, considering this is a very, very important topic, not just to me or you, but to the public in general, and for certain all the clients that come to the Titan Group. When you get a case, do you have any expectation how it's going to turn out? And the reason why I ask is because sometimes, we can't help. I mean, we're human. We have emotions, and sometimes you'll read something, right? Or you'll get an intake, if you will, and you'll sit there and go, oh, yeah, well, this is going to be sustained because this is does that kind of make sense?
Sure.
Have you had that experience? Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Not as much as I would have in the past, because I've learned over time to not make quick judgments like that. Just take your time and let the facts take you where they take you. It's easy to get a preconceived notion about, well, this cop really stepped in it, or this citizen's a liar because they got an extensive criminal history, They're a drug addict, they're this, they're that, and a lot of times it's not what you expect. So,
and in addition to that comment is sometimes, and maybe you can agree to this, is that what you see on a face sheet, the summary of what I suppose the department would believe, your client, right, would believe to be alleged misconduct, when you start investigating, gathering the facts, gathering all this evidence, doesn't really turn out to be exactly how it started.
Correct. Yeah, I had one case I can talk about briefly before. There's another case I'd like to get into more in depth, but I had one case where one of the agencies that contracts with Titan Group hired us to do an internal affairs investigation for them, where an officer had struck a suspect in the face several times with his firearm. Now, all of us as former cops, we think normally you would never want to hit a guy with your gun for a couple different reasons, right? You could have an accidental discharge. You could accidentally kill him when that wasn't your intent. You could shoot somebody else. You could damage your weapon to where you can't fire it if you need to. So I had a lot of questions when I saw that. But when I interviewed the complainant, of course, he was a career criminal out of another state, was actually wanted for pointing a gun at a police officer, got shot at, and then escaped that initial scene and came to California. But it was determined, of course, big surprise, this guy wasn't real credible. He made some false statements, and yes, the officer did strike him in the face with his firearm, but there were some good reasons. And when we interviewed the officer, he was very articulate, very knowledgeable. His answers came without hesitation. I don't think there was any attempt on his part to be deceptive. He was pretty large in stature. The other guy was skinny. Initially, it looks like his body camera had fallen off. So nothing was on film, and it could lead people to believe he's trying to cover something up.
Of course.
He's alone out in the middle of nowhere with this guy, and he just put a beating on him. And that really wasn't what it was. He caught up to him. They ended up on the ground, and as he is struggling with this suspect, he had his gun. The guy had grabbed a hold of his firearm. And when he tried to initially pull it back, the guy's hanging on to it. And so finally he said, I couldn't get my gun away from him pulling back, so I just rammed it into him. And then he still tries to grab it, so I struck him a few times, was able to holster my weapon and roll him over and get him in custody. That made perfect sense as to exactly how the lacerations on the guy's face lined up, the level of injury. And believe me, if this was a rogue officer, he could have done a lot more to that guy.
Oh, no,
than he did.
absolutely.
So,
I got to tell you, man, I know in the academy, with your gun, it's all bets are off.
Sure.
You start reaching or grabbing or attempting to grab any of that sort as it relates to my firearm. I'm sure that whoever's listening and watching, all you law enforcement officers out there, all bets are off. We can all agree to that.
Oh yeah, and if you wanted to, that was another way that I knew this officer was a good person. I mean, he could have killed this guy out in the middle of nowhere and just lied about it. He chose not to, and even said, he goes, I didn't want to take this guy's life. It was getting very close.
Yeah.
But rather than shooting him at that moment, I felt I could get control. It wasn't quite at the point of shooting him yet, but he didn't want to kill this guy.
No,
he used
absolutely.
very reasonable force.
Yeah. Finish this sentence for me. Internal affairs is known as.
I think for some cops, it's thought of as a headhunting unit in the department.
I like that.
And for some citizens, it's thought of as a rubber stamp for police misconduct. Kind of the cover-up unit, the police covering up for their own. And then, of course, other people, I think, have a more realistic, mature view of it.
Oh, of course. Let's see. The Rat Squad?
Yeah.
You've heard of that.
Oh, yeah.
The Dark Side.
Yeah, the dark side for
Blue
sure.
Falcons.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
I've heard the term evil office.
Evil
by
office.
employees.
What is it? Desk jockeys.
Yeah.
Cop haters.
Right.
Yeah, I've heard them all. And I bring that up to say that here we are, right? Here we are 24 years later in law enforcement, 30 years later in law enforcement. Yeah. And someone reminded me today that Dragnet actually had an episode about internal affairs.
They did. I watched it.
In the 40s where, they were corrupt and they're out to get you. Is there anything that we can learn, I suppose, from this stigma? Or how, I guess a better question is, what can we do to change that stigma?
I think...
Even if we can.
Yeah, I think with honest employees, just how you come at people matters. I think if you come at people with the attitude of, as an agency, just internal affairs or command staff, you're guilty, you're in serious trouble, it right off the bat, I think, puts people in a defensive mindset.
Yeah.
If you're polite and courteous, at least professional with people, and go, hey, there's been some allegations made. Obviously, the allegations are serious. As long as you tell the truth, you did the right thing. We're here to protect your rights. If you made a mistake, just be honest, fall on your sword, everything will work out. And if there's serious misconduct, of course, then there's not a lot you can do other than just do your job as best you can and let the chips fall where they fall.
Yeah. I'm going to jump on that comment that you made about the way we come at the accused employee, if you will, and Savage Training Group, where I teach our 2-day internal affairs OIS, officer involved shooting investigation course. We do have a section where we have this group exercise, if you will. We kind of role play.
Right.
And what I've learned from this role playing is that, I'll role play and I'll be like the officer, like the accused officer, and I'll come up to the table and say, okay, all right, well, here, you already have the scenario, so go ahead and here we are, a compelled interview, and ask me questions. Right. And so what starts happening is, as the other students in the class are listening, they use the term re-victimization.
Right.
And you know what? I didn't realize that re-victimization goes both ways.
Sure.
It's how you come at the officer in this compelled interview. And think about it. He or she is probably thinking the worst of the worst.
Well, yeah, they're scared.
They're scared, right? They're afraid, of course. I mean, especially a young officer that's never been through an IA in a small agency. And
it's intimidating.
It could be intimidating. And it has to be also be very careful and strategic as your approach, your attitude, your demeanor, your disposition when it comes to who happens to be making that complaint, the complainant. Right? Wouldn't you agree?
Sure.
Because
Absolutely.
the complainant, especially public.
Yep.
And I am focusing the lens on a public complainant because they might feel as if the cops probably did something wrong.
Yeah.
And to your experience, maybe you can kind of elaborate a little bit on that because it doesn't always seem to be that way.
Right. They frequently have that perception. That's they express that a lot of times in the beginning part of their interview, is their fear is cops, protecting cops. And it's really intimidating, I think, for a citizen to actually go inside a police department on our own turf, so to speak, and give a statement in internal affairs, that's got to be really hard for them.
Yeah.
It really, really does. You know, if they're telling the truth and all they're seeing are law enforcement employees and they're by themselves, or
At a
maybe have an
disadvantage.
attorney with them, but yeah, they're at a huge disadvantage in their mind. Something else too, I think, in regards to the employees and what we can do in IAs. I think, and IA itself can't control this, but for a lot of the administrators that might be listening to this, I firmly believe, I think putting people on admin leave sometimes is an overused tool. I think sometimes some administrators use it as a club because they jump to conclusions and they're angry at the employees. And unless you really believe that there's an officer who's a danger to the public or somebody who's really out of control and you feel the facts are very strong that this happened, and if I put this guy or gal out on the street, they might hurt somebody or do something that's going to really damage our agency. And if that's not the case, a lot of times there's no reason to put them on admin leave. Let them keep working, because you got a guy or a gal sitting at home for 6-8 months and they're miserable, and that just makes it so much worse. They're scared. This investigation's their whole life. They're waiting. They're feeling it's dragging out. They don't know what's going to happen. And it's just, sometimes it's very unnecessary.
Oh, you are tapping into what I've been saying in the previous episodes about mental wellness.
Yeah.
I do know that we are doing a better job
Right.
at adhering or wrapping ourselves around the individual that who has suffered trauma, depression, stress, anxiety, but a lot of those particular sworn employees have to do with maybe they saw their partners commit suicide, or that they knew very close. That's devastating.
Sure.
Of course, an officer-involved shooting, right?
Right.
You take someone's life, and which is something I never experienced, but I can only imagine that you have to live with that for the rest of your life. Or you are with your partner and you're involved in an OIS, and your partner gets killed on the line of duty. Right. So you have all these situations in which you are going to suffer some type of mental illness. But what we don't talk about is when someone gets home and gets sent on administrative leave for something that you might believe and the needle hasn't moved yet.
Yeah.
It's kind of serious misconduct, but maybe it's not. But you know what? The best thing to do, which we're agreeing here that it's probably not the best practice, let's just send it home to see what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I got to tell you, I hope that a lot of these, the mental health practitioners that are involved with law enforcement are listening to this to start tapping into discipline, start tapping into someone who's facing, and here's the deal, even if you are the one that committed that serious misconduct and you are sent home where the needle is completely like, yes, this person has lied, or they committed fraud, whatever the case may be, let's also wrap ourselves around that particular sworn employee accused, and make sure that they're going to be okay regardless of the outcome.
Yeah, send them to counseling. Just make it mandatory initially. And if you don't, once maybe initially you put somebody on admin leave, and if you find out, okay, maybe it's likely this didn't happen, then bring them back to work.
Yeah.
Maybe you need to do that in the short term because something seems really bad. When you find out it's not, come on back to work in the meantime while this investigation plays out. And like you said, even if it's a serious case where maybe this person did something wrong, they're still a human being. You still hired them. You care about their mental health. You don't want them to commit suicide or go off the deep end further than they already did with this incident. So, yeah, that needs to be taken into consideration. Sure.
There's a lot at stake, a lot of stakeholders. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes.
There's a lot. The impact is just it goes around. It goes around to the police department, the community, and partners. And if you're in a small agency, it's everyone. Not to say that in a big agency like LAPD, like where I came from, it doesn't. I've seen. Oh gosh, I mean, I got stories where, we try real hard to make sure that they're going to be okay. But well, thank you for all that. Let's move on to the second segment. It's kind of like, it's a little bit of my favorite trip down memory lane. Let's see. I do know you graduated the academy in 1991. Riverside County Sheriffs,
Riverside County Sheriffs.
Yeah. Yep. Then you lateraled. So for the people who are not familiar with police jargon, if you will, so you just decided to go from Riverside to Fontana PD.
In 92, yeah.
Fontana Police Station. March of 1992.
March of 1992. Not the smartest thing to go before I had my post-basic. I was in my early 20s. You don't sometimes see the big picture.
Okay.
I was looking at better pay, more action, that type of thing. You know, I'm a young guy just starting my career out, and I grew up in the town. So I had a friend at the agency that time was kind of putting the bug in my ear. So I went there. And I started March of 92 and retired December 2020.
I tell you what, man, back in 1992, you know, and this is where I get jealous. If you bought a home into 1992 in Fontana, you're sitting pretty with that investment.
You are now, for sure.
Beautiful homes, beautiful city. I actually have a case with Fontana PD where an officer was facing termination on serious misconduct, but we'll talk about that. We'll save that for another conversation. Look, 1992, riots.
Right.
I got a question for you. When the verdict came out, where were you?
Actually, I was in an FTO program at Fontana, my second agency. It was in my second phase, and I was at home. I was working, I remember it very well, was working 5 in the afternoon to 3 o'clock in the morning was my shift. And I turned on the TV, and I saw Stacy Kuhn and Lawrence Powell, because I'd watched the trial. It was a big deal. I was a brand new cop. Hadn't even had a year on the street yet. Major case, televised every day. And when I saw Stacy Kuhn and Lawrence Powell shaking hands and smiling with their attorneys, I just went, whoa, this is going to be a rough day. I'm not in LA, but there was a lot of tension over that case. And when I heard the verdict and saw the acquittals and already saw people following them to their cars and you know how upset people were, I said, this is going to be really ugly, especially in LA. But some of it carried over in the Inland Empire as well.
And I bet you didn't go home for a couple days.
Didn't go home. We went on 12-hour shifts. We were on TAC alert, 2-man units, even though I was obviously in an FTO unit, but all the units were doubled up. 3 to 4 units dispatched every call, priority 1 calls only. We probably got hit that first night of the riot with, I would say probably at least about 30 commercial burglaries. Some businesses were firebombed. You know, we had crowds throwing rocks at motorists and, a certain part of town. It was ugly. It wasn't as bad as it was in Los Angeles. They didn't burn our city to the ground, but it was tense for a while.
Listen, for all you youngsters out there, it's a historical landmark incident, the Rodney King incident. Right. And it's a historical event when the city of Los Angeles burned down because of the verdict. So there's footage. So, go watch it. It's interesting. I love asking my guests who have been around, because that's a day where you just didn't go home. It's like, okay, honey, what? Loved ones, I'm not going to come back because there's a lot to do out here. So.
Right. Yeah, I bring it up to my kids now, and a lot of times they haven't even heard of that. I forget, it's a whole different generation. That was a huge deal then.
Totally get that. Yeah, so. I got a daughter. She's 19, and she's probably, we don't know anything about Rodney King,
right.
But that's besides the point. Okay, well, let's move on. So, corporal in 2004 in Fontana PD, right? Then you made, while you were a corporal, you were a detective, you worked gangs.
Yep, I worked as a detective for 5 years and a gang corporal,
Good. And then, lo and behold, congratulations, you made sergeant in 2012.
Thank you. Yep.
Yeah, best job. I keep telling everybody, sergeant
it's a great job.
It's a great position. It's a great job. I can tell you from my experience in a big machine, big agency like LAPD, you make sergeant and you do your patrol time. You can do patrol and just really have a crew of guys where you can guide and lead and all that stuff. But you can actually work internal affairs or other assignments, vice.
A lot of different assignments.
A lot of different assignments, so you become somewhat of an expertise, and guess what? Your lieutenants and everybody else is going to leave you alone because you're the expert. Right. Don't you agree?
For sure. Yeah, and at the agency I worked at, the last few years of my career, we had lieutenant watch commanders that would cover 24 hours, but a lot of times there was no lieutenant on after a certain after a certain hour, prior to maybe 2017. So you were a sergeant working graveyards, you were in charge of the city. That entire city was your responsibility. So it was very, I was very honored to be in that position. And it was a great job, though, just to be in charge and be able to run your team and train your people the way you want to and that type of thing.
Yep. So I know you worked in internal affairs as a sergeant. I do know that you became a detective sergeant. You worked investigations in 2018 when you finally said, you know what, I think it was 2020 when you said, it's time, a great career, I would imagine. Right. And here we are at a Titan Group. Let's move on to the next segment because that's really, really important. I appreciate you sharing your experience. But we are here to talk about internal affairs. Look, I'm going to leave the floor up to you because you and I have had a conversation about this particular case. It's unique.
Yeah.
It's unique in the sense that here we have an individual, a sworn accused employee that, you know what, it's probably someone that doesn't even belong doing this kind of job. So I'll leave the floor to you and tell us what happened, man.
Yeah. One of the agencies that hired my company, Titan Investigations, to do an internal affairs case. I get the case and I look at the facts, and it was a domestic violence complaint where the female came in, I believe, possibly the next morning or in the afternoon or evening of the day it happened. And she's pregnant. There was a extensive history of domestic violence, stalking, restraining order violations involving the same suspect who was the father of her child. They're not married. He shows up at her house in violation of the restraining order, forces his way into the door, pins her up against the wall, forearm against the throat. She tries to call 911. He rips her cell phone out of her hand and throws it across the room. Ends up tackling her, holding her down in a closet for several minutes, keeps her, false imprisonment for a period of time. Screams at her, yells at her, kind of roughhouses with her, wrestling with her, pins her to the ground, then decides to leave. Calls his mother. Mom picks him up. He goes to a town probably 50 miles away from the town where this occurred. Mm-hmm. The officer gets the report, takes this woman's statement, and never runs a previous events check with his own agency through dispatch to see how many prior incidents of domestic violence there were. Doesn't check to see if there's a current restraining order on file. Doesn't take a report on the incident. Does basically nothing. Tells her to go to another agency, get an updated restraining order, since the guy, and you can see the point in the interview, he had a body camera recording all this. And when she says that the suspect's probably at his mother's house in this other town, he closes up his notebook and he says, "Oh, well, there's nothing we can do about that. You need to go get your restraining order updated." There was no need to get a restraining order updated. It was current on file at his own agency. He never checked. So sends her away, doesn't do anything. The other agency, she goes there. They take a report and they're, appalled and call his agency and complain to a liaison civilian that worked both departments. Uh-huh. She made the complaint. And come to find out, this guy had a history of kissing off legitimate crimes. There was another case he had, all of this within like the past year and a half to 2 years of this incident occurring. He had a young girl, about 12, 13 years old, light-skinned, blonde, Caucasian female, was out in like 100-plus degree weather for like 3 days, dehydrated, severely sunburned, running away from home. Now, most police officers would look at that and go, why is this kid willing to be out in 100-plus degree weather? What is it going on at home that she doesn't want to be home? Right. She's being abused. And didn't take a report on that. Somebody else had to clean up his mess. The parents got arrested, charged with felony child abuse. He had another case where a young girl was being raped by a sibling. Didn't do anything on that because he said he didn't believe the girl. Another employee did that investigation. That person was arrested, facing a 50-year-to-life sentence for abusing a child under the age of 10. And this went on and on and on. And particularly if it were females that were lower income, lower class, he just seemed like he formulated an opinion in his mind. They're not credible. I don't believe you, and that was it. And didn't do any kind of investigation. So there was a pattern there. Mm-hmm. That pattern was occurring when they had a previous administrator running the agency, so I didn't blame that on the current administrator. There was nothing he could do about it at the time. But this is not an employee who's doing his job right. And I served him with a notice listing all the allegations. At the time, there were about 4 allegations, policy violations on how to investigate domestic violence, restraining orders, all those type of things. On the day of his interview, I show up with one of our other employees who is an attorney. The guy doesn't show up. The subject employee FTA's on his IA interview. So I had to get their administrators involved. And he had been served, signed it in the presence of an administrator from his own agency who also signed it. And they call him at home, and I can hear in the background, he's like, "What do you mean it's today?" So he's ordered in, shows up wearing board shorts, tank top, and flip-flops for an internal affairs interview. Wow. This is the attitude of this employee. And as I start doing his interview, be honest with you, the guy looked like he was coming down off of something, either like hungover. Mm-hmm. I didn't get into that aspect of it too much, but I'm like, this guy looks really disheveled. He's on his day off. And as I start going through the allegations, he says, I think maybe I should get an attorney. I said, yeah, I think you probably should have done that to begin with. I'll talk to you again in about a week. The attorney comes in, we go through all these allegations. I explain the policies to him, all the stuff that he clearly violated. the law requiring documentation of domestic violence that he violated, which is a misdemeanor, and get through the entire interview, like an hour and a half, and he's just making excuses nonstop. Feels he did nothing wrong through this entire process. We got a pregnant female that's been assaulted, prevented from calling 911, restraining order that's been violated. She was held prisoner in a closet for a few minutes. And I go, you got at least about 4 different crimes there. And when I finally got to the end of it, I said, do you really believe that the way you handled this domestic violence call was in compliance with state law, department policy, and industry standards? And finally, he hung his head and he goes, no. Okay, what could you have done different? And then the light bulb went off and he said a few things where he acknowledged finally that he'd done some things wrong. But
Okay.
This guy was just not really very high caliber, and somebody that clearly I think had some weird thought processes that I was picking up on throughout. And when I heard his history, like, maybe he shouldn't be in this profession. If he can't correct this kind of behavior, it's not somebody you want in law enforcement. He was a threat to victims of crimes. He wasn't doing his job, and people were in danger as a result of it.
If I may interject, who should we hold accountable?
I think you have to hold his supervisors prior to that latest administrator taking control of that agency responsible. Absolutely. That should have been, it was handled very informally. You don't send somebody else to clean up his mess and just let him off the hook entirely. You might have to have them clean up his mess, but you're going to discipline this employee. He'd been there for years. He was not a brand new cop that didn't know he was doing anything wrong. He was just being lazy for whatever reason.
Wow.
Or he maybe had some personal animosity toward the type of people that were making complaints. But either way, he should have been formally disciplined. It should have been documented, and there should have been progressive discipline.
Yeah, and
along the way.
I can 100% agree with you. It almost feels like there is some deep-rooted issues.
Yeah.
Which someone who's cutting these corners and someone who's just not paying attention to these domestic type of incident service calls, you kind of wonder. And I would think not just a supervisor, that's from him all the way up.
Yeah, and sending a young little girl back into a home where she's being raped by a sibling, he was just going to do that and not do anything about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a problem.
During the interview, if I may ask, do you feel, even though towards the end he said, yeah, I could have done something different, did you feel some sense of accountability?
A small amount, yes. Yeah, a small amount. And that, what I thought about is, who knows what this guy may have been like if he'd have been held accountable all the way back. It might have prevented it from getting to that point. Because, I don't know what's going on in his head. I don't know if he's kind of gone down a rabbit hole over the course of his career where he just doesn't care anymore, or if he was always that way. But he took a tiny bit of ownership toward the end of it. Yeah. Not much.
Yeah. Look, as far as lessons learned, what can we, what kind of takeaways besides the fact that there is some accountability? What would you, I suppose, in your opinion, what can we learn as you got administrators listening, young officers, and the audience varies. Sure. What can we learn from this?
I think in law enforcement, we got to take things like that more serious than those initial incidents were taken. As I mentioned, there should have been discipline, and he should have been either retrained, find out, is this something you don't know? If so, this is a training issue. I believe you knew. If not, and you're just being lazy or you have some animosity toward these victims, he's got to be held accountable and punished. This can't be a pattern. And if he can't or won't change his behavior, then you need to find a different line of work. And that wasn't done previously. Yeah. So, that has to be done.
Right. Do you feel his lessons learned also goes into maybe his backgrounds or something along the lines to try to, the hiring process, if you will?
Yeah, definitely. Want to do a thorough background and really get into somebody's mind, see what they're made of. What are their morals? What are their values? Why are they getting into this profession?
Do you feel, reflecting on it now, let me ask you this, just based on your experience, is that something maybe perhaps during the background process or as they're processing to to get appointed to the academy, is that something that we can kind of identify or maybe even come and I'm asking because I'm not familiar with the background process in terms of whether or not a background investigator is able to chime in to the bosses or get a report from the psychological process. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's really important when you talk to people that are listed as references in a background that you do thorough interviews. And sometimes if you knock on doors and talk to people that weren't listed as references. Those are the ones that are really going to tell you the truth. Sometimes they may have an agenda, but you got to balance that out and test their credibility. But definitely polygraphs are huge. Be surprised how many people with Titan investigations that we do backgrounds on will sit there and check the no box on every single question of, have you ever done this? Have you ever done that criminal behavior? And no. And then right before they go into their polygraph, we had one guy that admitted all kinds of stuff. I mean, from bestiality to, peeping on a relative in the shower. And I mean, this guy was a deviant, and he was actually working in a school at the time with kids that were special needs kids. And I mean, we were not only horrified that he wanted to be a police officer, we're thinking this guy that shouldn't even be around kids, many of them who are nonverbal.
Yeah, you're talking about criminality.
But yeah, behavior. That came out right before his polygraph examiner. He told the polygraph examiner the truth about all that stuff. So needless to say, after discussing that with the agency head, he didn't get hired, but thank God we caught that.
Yeah, no, absolutely, man. Thanks for sharing that. I got a question for you, because you've been doing these investigations for Titan Group for quite some time. I would like to know, or I suppose we would like to know, the ratio, the percentage of, like, when you get an internal affairs case, how many of those cases on a percentage ratio end up being sustained? Like, in other words, this investigation right here is they did it, it occurred, so it's sustained, as opposed to the ones that were either exonerated or unfounded, meaning it just didn't happen.
I would say with law enforcement, probably about half.
Okay.
Yeah. And some of them are sustained and don't result in serious discipline, and then there are some that are misconduct. With civilians, I would say probably 2/3 to 3/4.
Okay.
Depending on the type of allegations.
Right. Right. And you and I were talking before we actually started the episode about, the fact that let's just make sure that we let the audience know that the fraction, it's really not as big as people think it is, right? Because that is a misconception. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's true. And I should clarify a little bit. I think like on use of force complaints, because that's the one cops fear the most, right?
Of course.
We're one of the few jobs in the world where you actually have to physically hit somebody with a baton, kick, punch. Used to do neck restraints, not anymore, right? But use force, shoot somebody with a taser, with your gun. Very few other jobs is that a normal part of your job description. Yeah. But those type of investigations, I would say, unsustained, are probably in the 90s, 95%, because most of the time they're criminals that are lying. They resisted arrest, and they don't understand how much force has to be used to control them, or they don't care because they have their own agenda.
And it's not textbook.
Right.
And it's ugly.
Right. And most of the time there's no criminal intent on the part of the officer, usually. They're scared, they're trying to defend themselves, defend other officers or civilians, or just trying to overcome resistance and get somebody into custody.
Absolutely.
And it's ugly, and sometimes it is violent.
Yeah, no, totally. And you and I can agree, the old 35A, hey, overcome resistance, effect an arrest, and prevent an escape. Right. And you and I wasn't for ATD. That was my ask, tell, and do. Hey, sir, turn around, put your hands behind your head. F you, I'm not going to do it. I'm telling you to put your hands behind your head.
Right.
F you, I'm not going to do it. Okay, then you do it. Ask, tell, and do.
Ask, tell, make.
Yeah, ask, tell, and make. I heard it a lot. ATM or ATD, But, and which, by the way, under AB 392, the new assembly bill, which revamped, what I consider the Bible, 835 APC, which is your use of force definition, policy, lethal, the whole nine, using deadly force. There is de-escalation, and I'm all for that. I know it's a fancy word.
Sure.
It's a fancy way of saying, hey, we need to ensure that in certain circumstances, we can, kind of talk you out of it if the circumstances allow you. But, and I'm all for that. But there is situations where there isn't, and times have changed.
Times have changed, and the thing with de-escalation, because I hear that word thrown around a lot too, is de-escalation requires both sides being willing to de-escalate, and it requires cooperation from the citizens. And a lot of the citizens, where you see these incidents, they have no interest in cooperating at all. So, and it seems like 100% of the responsibility is put on the cop. I understand we're supposed to be the responsible person, but no matter how much you try to de-escalate, if the other party has no interest in de-escalating, it's not going to de-escaude. It's that simple.
If I may interject, you know what? You're preaching with Scott Savage, the founder and the owner of Savage Training Group, when he does his tactical de-escalation course. that we have a full-blown conversation about,
Right.
Okay, here I am, and guess what? Boop, you're de-escalated. No, it's an offer.
an
Both
offer.
willing parties
Correct.
have to be able to somehow, some way, come to some common ground. And you know what? Sometimes, and this is the educational portion of this, is that sometimes it doesn't happen that way.
Right.
A lot of the circumstances or the situation doesn't even allow you to de-escalate, right,
Not
Darren?
safe to do so. Yeah.
Yeah, you and I can be right now going to 7-Eleven and, hey, bro, let's go get a cup.
Yeah.
And the minute we put it in park,
Right.
we see these two guys we hear gunfire.
Right.
And they're coming out.
Pointing a gun at us. Yeah.
Pointing a
there's
gun
no time
at
to
us.
de-escalate.
I don't think there's time to de-escalate. I think we can all agree to that. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and thanks for giving me a chance to clarify on the sustain rate, because I was thinking on duty, off duty, all different types of allegations, and then maybe 6 allegations, 3 of them are sustained in a minor way. So yeah, for people listening, they think 50% sustained, that's horrible.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you break it down a little bit by type of allegation, on duty, off duty, it's
Absolutely.
nowhere near as high as 50%
Oh
on use
no!
of force cases.
And before I forget, I know we had that conversation where, look, and I say this a lot too from my experiences. When I was an advocate in internal affairs, I always used to tell all my colleagues and my ex-partners is, look, when you do something on duty, for the most part, the department is pretty forgiving.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of variables, there's a lot of circumstances, right? We can all agree to that. But when your behavior off duty is alleged misconduct,
Right.
man, that scope
yeah.
gets so narrow.
Sure.
And they pay attention to every single little thing
Sure.
that you did, or in some cases that you didn't do. And you and I can agree, if it's off duty, it can be pretty serious, right? And I want to make sure that we do get that right, which is the reason why we came up with a high number of or a high percentage of a lot of the internal affairs complaint allegations towards officers from the public while they're on duty has a high number of unfounded. In other words, it just didn't occur, and at times can be a misunderstanding.
Sure.
Someone sees a lens from one way and someone sees it from another way, right?
They don't see their own behavior and how they acted and why the officer had to respond the way they did.
Absolutely. Well, hey, thank you for all that. And okay, let's. Anything else before we wrap up a little, about internal affairs, because we're going to get into the worst and best.
Yeah, I just wanted to put out that internal affairs is extremely important to protect and support police officers that risk their lives and their safety to serve the community. But it's also important for the citizens too, to know that their police department or sheriff's department make sure they're hiring good people that can be trusted. Because over time we have these incidents, a small number of incidents have hurt the public trust, and it's usually a small number of people. But what agencies need to understand is because of the type of work we're in, a small number of cops who are doing stuff on duty can have a tremendous impact on our profession, because we're not a type of job where we sit back in a corner of a warehouse somewhere and don't interact with people. That's our job every day. Yeah. And if you have somebody working for 10 or 15 years that is, overbearing or is a bully or is flirting inappropriately with motorists, different sex or whatever, maybe nothing severe happens, but every one of those people remembers that experience.
Oh, absolutely.
And they take that into the voting booth. They take that into the jury box when they're sitting on a criminal trial or a civil trial. If we're accused of stuff, they're a lot more likely to believe the complainant, I think, if they've had a negative experience like that with that small percentage of officers that are like that.
Oh, absolutely. 100%. You bring up a good point. With that small fraction of officers who commit misconduct on duty has such an impact.
Huge effect, bigger than I think we ever really understood, because of the number of people they come in contact with in this profession.
And not only that, I mean, if let's take an agency of 400 sworn officers, right? And you and I both, we were having this discussion. Let's say on any given day, calls for service out in patrol, probably like 80, maybe 50, if that.
Sure.
One commits, one gets a sustained complaint for misconduct. You know what? Next thing you know, we can't paint the brush to say, well, all the other 49 are like that as well. So yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, and something too I wanted to mention is for smaller agencies, I think a lot of times it's really difficult for them to do serious misconduct allegations because there's personal relationships involved. And having worked IAs in the public sector and in the private sector now for a couple of years, I am a huge advocate of third-party entities investigating serious misconduct within smaller agencies, because you have friendships, you have an accusation of bias, you're covering for this guy because you've known him, or vice versa, you never liked him, you're treating him differently than your friends, that type of thing. That's where companies like ours, I think, come into play, and you have seasoned investigators where it takes all that off the table.
Oh, absolutely. Titan Group, it's there. It has to be there. I preach this again when I'm teaching for Savage Training Group in our classes. Yeah. Sometimes I come up, I was just up north on Clovis, next to Fresno, somewhere out there, and we were having, on break, I was talking to one of the students, he was a sergeant, I say, hey, who's your neighbor agency? They're like, well, Fresno is. You know what? If you guys actually have an internal type of alleged misconduct, you know what? Have your chief call their chief and do them a solid.
Yep.
Because here's the deal. If it happened on Clovis and it's Clovis internal harassment, hostile working environment, you name it, that's within partners, you know what? That bias, whether you want to, whether even if you're the command staff officer, you think, no, we're going to handle it. You know what? Do yourself a favor. Do them a solid. And if not, then outsource it.
Yeah.
Especially with internal.
Sure. Because
more than anything.
The chief or the sheriff, they're the ones going to be sued anyway when it goes to litigation. Yeah. And they're the ones that are accused of bias. Well, they may have all the power in the world inside that building, and they think they're directing the investigation sometimes, or I'm going to get the outcome I want. But the minute it goes to an appeals process, a skelly, a lot of times the chief or sheriff's not even allowed to be in the room. It's up to the city manager or the county board of supervisors, whoever is sitting in on their skelly arbitration. Chief's just another witness, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Superior court, and you never know the type of arbitrator you're going to get, the type of superior court judge you're going to get. They may have a whole different worldview towards law enforcement employees versus law enforcement management than that chief or sheriff has. They may not see things your way. So it's much cleaner, I think, to hire outside experts that have a lot of experience, and you can show, hey, I was being as objective as I could be.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, and I hate to pass judgment on chiefs or command staff or small agencies, but you know what? Sometimes, you know what? Just put your ego aside, man. I know you don't like to be told.
Sure.
I don't want to, someone else to
it's their agency. They want
of course, and I get that. I understand that, but you know what? Be flexible. Just be flexible. And I'm not suggesting to do it for every case.
Everything, but the more serious ones.
Exactly.
If it's a termination, demotion, serious suspension,
harassment, anything that's inside of the workplace environment. Because here's the deal, you and I both know this, it's going to have a huge impact.
It is.
On the entire morale of the department. And I appreciate that. Okay, let's move on. Let's get to it. This is the segment that, it's touching, because I'm going to go with worst first and then best. So, okay, Darren, let's go. Worst incident or something you saw during your 30-year career?
There's many. Some of the really severe ones. Toward the end of my career when I was a detective sergeant, we had some really severe child abuse cases where children were starved to death or beaten to death by their parents. But one that really stuck out in my mind was actually a young mom, single mom. Her and her boyfriend broke up. She had a 3-year-old son. And they're in this upstairs bedroom. She has an adult brother that lives with her and her parents. I think she's about 20, 21 years old, 3-year-old boy. She's taking a nap on her bed. She's got her son laying on the bed with her, eating ice cream, watching cartoons. Door's unlocked. The adult brother comes into the room, just unannounced, charges in there, starts stabbing her. She gets paralyzed almost immediately because he stabbed her in the back of the neck. She can't move. She has to sit there and watching him on the ground stabbing her 3-year-old son. The suspect runs out of the house. 45 minutes later, she wasn't able to call because she can't move. We finally get to the house, and she's telling us that the last words are told the patrol officers. I didn't talk to her because she'd already been transported separately to the hospital. But she told the patrol officers her son's last words are, "I love you, Mommy," as he's laying there. And she didn't know he'd passed away until she got to the hospital, paralyzed in her hospital bed because he's transported separately, and they tell her that he's dead. But the part that really got to me, besides just the sheer evil of a grown man stabbing a 3-year-old child to death after he stabs his mom and his own sister, was looking around her room. And this is because as I'm older, this stage in my career, I'm a father, I'm a grandfather, and I'm looking at all the pictures on the wall of her and her son, at Disneyland, and together we're unstoppable and all this stuff on the pictures. And it was just gut wrenching because you could tell this kid was just her whole life, and she was such a good mother to him. And her own brother just took everything from her. And she eventually was able to walk, I found out later on. But listening to this guy It was my team that responded out, and then looking at the interview with him, and he's laughing as he's describing this stuff, and he's just as evil as you could possibly be.
And people sometimes, you know, for the ones who are trying to get into this type of profession, that's reality.
Yeah.
And those, you know, thank you for sharing that with us, because you're going to have to live with that for the rest of your life. And I appreciate you sharing with that. And certainly, all of us, all of my guests have some really horrible stories. It's the worst that God has to offer. So I'm glad we take care of that. Thank you. Let's go with best, man. Give me something fun or the best moment you're rewarding in your career.
I think rewarding, there were many, but one that stands out again, probably because it's very recent, but my last year at the Fontana Police Department, when I was a detective sergeant, we had our detectives work cold case homicides in the past, kind of piecemeal. In addition to their active cases, if they had extra time, which was hardly ever, they would do a little bit of work, follow-up work on these cold cases. Well, it was a really lousy way to work cold cases. They need somebody doing that full time, because the new cases never stop coming in, right? And they're the priority. So I brought that up to my lieutenant and captains, and the chief got involved, and we decided, once San Bernardino Sheriff's Department wanted or was willing to take on one of our officers along with their cold case unit. So we had this female detective that was really interested in working cold case homicides. We thought she'd be a really good fit. She had a strong interest in it. We assigned her to their task force, and we had several cases that we'd gone over that were workable. You know, you had solvable cases if we just had the time to work them. And within about 3 or 4 months, she ended up solving a 40-year-old cold case homicide.
Wow.
It was one of our, I think it was our second oldest one at the time. And it was a woman that had been raped and murdered, dumped in a orange grove back in 1980 in Fontana. It was mostly orange groves south of the 10 freeway, because I grew up in that town. There wasn't a lot of homes there then. And to see, you know, these women now, her sisters, I think she had 3 or 4 sisters. We had one of them on a conference call that lived out of state. And when they went up out of state, got a DNA sample from this guy, you know, and when we got a DNA hit and the DA agreed to file murder charges on this guy, we called all of them in. They didn't know why. And they had been waiting 40 years to hear this. And it was the guy they thought it was all along. And to see the reaction of these women, it was one of the most emotional experiences of my life. I mean, they were hooting and hollering and crying and screaming and laughing and going around the room giving hugs. And I mean, all the men in there were fighting back tears. It was just overwhelming.
Oh,
the emotion. It was so great to see them, just the joy that they had and the closure that they knew that now they were going to get.
Yeah,
they've been waiting that long.
And for us, that's what you come on the job for.
Yeah, and you rarely get that.
Oh.
You usually don't see the follow-up. Something goes to court and they either plead out or you never,
For 40 years.
Yeah, for 40 years, you certainly don't get the closure very often.
Absolutely. Darren, you know what? Hey, we just met not too long ago. I came on board the Titan Group. Thank you for, allowing me to come on in and, work some cases. And I got to tell you, it's been a blessing knowing that I'm part of a team that does some really, really good good work, good investigative work. And you know what? We're at the end here, so I'll leave the floor to you. You can just any parting words. Look, any advice? There might be some young officer in San Bernardino that's probably thinking, "Yeah, I want a lateral," or someone in Fontana. Any young officer, any seasoned officer, someone that's trying to make and promote sergeant. Any advice you can give, man?
Yeah, for somebody that, especially somebody that's trying to promote, realize your main job is to train your employees as best you can, right? Give them all the support and encouragement they deserve, because most of them deserve it. All of them actually deserve it, all of them. And then if there is minor issues that come up, you need to address them right away, because minor issues over time become bigger issues, right? And sometimes it affects an entire agency, and it's not fair to that employee. It's not fair to the people they got to work with. It's not fair to the agency. And there was a phrase that I heard from an ex-LAPD guy who's actually had some involvement as a supervisor with Rampart, famous case, right? And it always stuck with me. He said, "You encourage what you tolerate." So if you tolerate a high standard, that's usually what you're going to get. If you tolerate mediocrity or misconduct, it's going to get worse over time.
Hey, brother, thank you so much for showing up. I really enjoyed our conversation. There's definitely some takeaways, some lessons learned, and I will see you soon, man. We're going to wrap this up.
All right. Thank you, Marlon, for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And like everything else, look, you know what? Be safe out there. Don't forget to go Code 6. Thank you.